Atif, welcome to Speak Like a CEO.
Oliver, it's a pleasure to join you.
So you're a former C-level at very big, very well-known companies like McDonald's, Volvo, MGM. You were in charge of the Kindle business at Amazon. With all your experience, what makes a company successful?
Well, most people will say culture, and at the heart of it, I really try and establish a culture of problem solving. The interesting thing is that it is more personal than what it means to the company. I think, creating a culture of problem solving or a winning culture really comes down to allowing people to find their contribution within that. And so how people are seen and heard and contribute, I think those are the critical ingredients that lead to the kind of culture that you want.
And who's in charge of making sure that happens?
It always cascades from the top, and it happens one interaction at a time. So it's not a slogan. It's not something that can be taught in the classroom, or it could, but only after it's, modeled for real. But the way it cascades is one leadership interaction at a time, one meeting at a time, where the, leaders are good at listening, at inviting contribution, and getting people to see the value of their contribution in the work and the decisions that a company makes.
Of the companies you worked for that you led, is there stories, there good example you could point us to that we, understand what that means in practice?
Well, what it means in practice is for a leader is often starting a meeting with listening. Most people do come into meetings, especially with C-level executives, looking for direction, which is important, and I agree with that. So in my case, the stories are things like my first 30 days at McDonald's. I moved from Amazon to McDonald's. It's a very big shift. Culturally, Amazon is a meeting where there's a lot of contribution from around the table, regardless of, the senior person in the room. And McDonald's is a very different culture where the senior person really has the last say. And so in my first 30 days, people would start a meeting and look for me to sort of tell them, the direction that we're headed, which of course I had a sense of, but I never wanted to lead with that. So in a meeting, doing a bit of listening, asking a good amount of questions, which would initially confuse people because they were not used to kind of putting their perspectives on the table or sharing the why behind their perspectives. And I really wanted to bring that out so we can make a better decision and create the clarity that everyone could see. And so in that first 30 days, it was kind of a meeting of two different cultural approaches to leadership. And of course, this takes some time, a couple of quarters for people to have an understanding of how they work, whether they're leaders or people who work for leaders. But eventually when that clicks, I think it's very powerful.
That is so fascinating. And it's interesting that people actually do shift, right? So, because sometimes it's said, in some cultures, people are just more passive. But when the leadership changes, that can change as well, right?
Absolutely. One would be very surprised at the impact. I mean, for a vast majority, people are being maybe heard and seen. They feel heard and seen maybe for the first time in a long time. Is very empowering for them. At the same time, it's not all blue skies. For some people, it's an adjustment because now they have to get a little bit of practice. So, getting in touch with the why behind their perspective, or actually contributing and like really being, on and engaged, as opposed to just being passive and following orders. And so you do begin to kind of have people get into two different camps of those who are comfortable and empowered by it, and people who might be a bit scared, but even those people might take some time and hopefully come around.
Yeah. I mean, you were the first Fortune 500 chief digital officer of all time. So that was at McDonald's. And I wonder what leading digitalization at McDonald's taught you about change in organizations, because McDonald's, at least from the outside, has moved from, traditional business, traditional hierarchies, etc., to quite a digital business, and certainly thanks to you as well. But what did it teach you about change in organizations towards more digitalization?
Well, it was my first experience with large-scale change management, so to speak. Of course, we didn't refer to it that way, but in hindsight, that's really what it was. So for me personally, what it meant is coming in and initially being very focused on the vision of how could we reinvent convenience around technology. And so I thought my job was to contribute the vision, or the what we want to be when we grow up kind of thing. And of course, that was part of the job. But what I didn't know, and I learned, was that how the machine works is really the bigger lesson I picked up. And that's really interesting to me. So as I reflect back over the 10-year run in the C-suite, understanding how the machine works, is this the type of machine that's going to help us move at the pace and velocity that we need to keep up with the world? And if it's not, then how do we tweak this machine, from a leadership perspective in terms of how we collaborate, all of those things. That was sort of what I learned a ton about. And of course, when I learned things work well and we can unleash the power of teams and put in place like modern management practices, I brought that to other organizations because I knew it's very portable and extensible across industries.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And we may not think about McDonald's as an AI-driven company, but it seems like they're quite active in using AI, using modern technologies, etc.
Well, there is a ton of customer data. And when you have data and you have high volume and the scale of McDonald's, then there's ample opportunity to, optimize everything, especially around the customer experience. So you have a customer journey and, McDonald's may seem like a simple business. In some ways it is, and will always be there. But at the same time, at that scale, when you can use data to get insights, but also begin to make things work a little bit better for the customer, one interaction at a time, that really, really does add up.
Could you give us an example of digital change you introduced at McDonald's that we may recognize as the occasional customer?
Well, if you walked into a McDonald's and you used the kiosk, that's obviously a very visible aspect of the kind of products that we delivered. It's essentially a self-service experience. You can, kind of configure and customize your meal. But more importantly, you can actually take your time. You don't feel rushed in the line. So that's, I think, very powerful. It is a way for people to kind of personalize their experience. And a lot of people use the kiosks and they are logged in sort of with their profile, or they can connect to their customer profile. So now you have a way to understand people's preferences, and that's very powerful. Of course, all of these interactions around getting your food are available now through a mobile phone, through a kiosk, through a delivery. When you come to the restaurant, you can use the drive-through, the curbside, or the in-store kiosks. These things were really not stood up at all, when I got there, but working with a ton of people in the whole organization, we kind of stood up this entirely new way of using McDonald's.
Yeah, that's super impressive. And in your book, you recount the changes you introduced at Volvo, Swedish traditional car manufacturer, not necessarily known for, digital leadership in the space of the car industry. But when you came under the leadership of a new CEO, I think things changed as well.
Well, we had a visionary CEO. He's actually back in the chair right now. So good for the organization. And I think he needed, a few willing partners, so to speak. And I was one of those people to, have not only co-create the vision, but bring it to life. And so things like a subscription for cars or new ways of bringing the cars to the customers that reduce friction in the buying experience, that was really a core tenet, as was the kind of in-car experience around infotainment and really making the in-car experience the same as your mobile phone, and a lot of integrations there. So when you work with somebody who's, a willing partner there, you still have a lot of hard things to figure out, and you've got to modernize the organization, the talent, the structure. You've got to have really interesting strategic partnerships with major companies like Google on the Android side and Amazon, and you've got to be willing to move at the same pace as those companies. And all of that, thankfully, with the group of people I mentioned, was achieved. And I think that's still paying dividends for the organization now.
Yeah, amazing. And you recount that story in your book, which is called Decision Sprint, which is a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And it's actually a really fantastic book, came out a couple of years ago. What's the premise of the book?
The premise of the book is the focus on upstream work.
Yeah.
I created a contrast between upstream and downstream. Many large organizations that have been around a while, whether it's Walmart, Bertelsmann, Coca-Cola, they really excel at execution. Once they decide what to do, they are really a machine. They're well-oiled when it comes to execution. That's the downstream part. Mm-hmm. It can take weeks, months, quarters, and even longer to arrive at alignment and decision making and do that confidently so we can move on to execution. And that is an entire upstream journey. And in many cases, people can't explain how it works. How do we actually do that kind of work? We have an idea, objective, whether the idea is from the CEO or from someone in the rank and file, it's a bright idea. Like, how are we getting organized to, explore it, figure out the right problems to solve, come up with the recommendations. That whole workflow is what I refer to as being something that has a method to the madness. So the book is really trying to demystify this upstream work and help any team in any organization embrace it.
And the idea would be that the organization gets better at decision making and therefore can execute faster, therefore gets a competitive advantage. Is that fair?
100%, because, I believe the competitive advantage of organizations is decision making. And interestingly, a side story is I thought a lot about how we could improve decision making and maybe creating even technologies so that companies, when they're at the decision point, could kind of weigh these different decisions and come up with the right one. But then when I shared this idea externally, and I shared it with a very famous venture capitalist, Ben Horowitz, he said, "Hey, this is a really interesting idea, but how do people get to this point? Like, isn't all the interaction and all the meetings, like the months leading up to the decision point?" And that sent me on a personal journey of reflection where I was like, oh yes, actually that workflow of how you go from the initial stage to the decision point, I want to create a methodology for how you can address that comprehensively and get ahead of any of the pitfalls that come up along the way.
Yeah.
And so that was the genesis of Decision Spring.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that there is usually no methodology in organizations to get to that point, which is where your book comes in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've written a book. It was essentially a universal approach to problem solving. Like, the interesting thing is, in the beginning, the bright idea sounds amazing and people get inspired, but then we quickly realize the 0 to 1 problem is really a 1 to 9 problem or a 1 to 99 problem. Meaning, like, how do you actually make the promising idea viable, aligned, get people on board with it, really feasible at a high level of scale. And that's where all the issues come up and the questioning and people poke holes. And there's nothing wrong with that, because those are probably very relevant questions. It's just that there needs to be a way to put action against these unknowns. And I believe, as opposed to letting good ideas die, we can take action on the unknowns so more good ideas can flourish.
Yeah. It's often held that you need to create some sort of skunk works or Google X or, basically different part of the organization that's shielded from the corporate bureaucracy that inevitably arises in large organization. Is that your view as well?
It was in the past, but I've changed my mind, actually. Mm-hmm. I think that's largely been a response to, the likely kind of hesitation and resistance by the core of the organization. Yeah. And the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, literally, like at the seed stage. And that's not very nice. So organizations have reacted by compartmentalizing things and saying, okay, we're going to shield people and they can do their ideation. But here's the rub, and here's the problem, is that those people, let's say people who are, responsible for these innovative pushing of the boundaries, they're constrained by the fact that they actually need to understand and know what the gotchas are, what the hard parts are. And when they're separated from the core of the organization, they don't have access to that knowledge. So they actually have incomplete knowledge to do their problem solving. And so the ideal sweet spot is that we get the questions without the questioning. Those are two different things. If you've been in an organization for 25 years, I definitely want to talk to you, because you know the hard parts, and I'd rather hear them from you rather than discover them when we put them into the wild. But the skepticism is not something that's helpful. It's more like surfacing the unknowns. And so that's why in Decision Spring, where I really focused, Oliver, is basically how to, in the beginning, get the right questions and actually take out the skepticism and just make them neutral, objective questions that you can action and get to the bottom of.
How do you do that, though? The skepticism seems to be ingrained in a lot of organizations. Oh, this won't work here, or, this is so difficult. Oh, we've already tried this, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, we have to get around this human pitfall, and the best way to do it is by giving people, transparency into the workflow. So you say, hey, we're not at the recommendation stage. This could be the worst idea ever, but we do have a space for exploration and discovery. And that's not going to be very time consuming. Maybe it would take 2 weeks. And you could really help us by sharing the key questions that we should include in our exploration. So what are those things? And when you do it that way, Oliver, you begin to flip the behavioral dynamic, and the questions become the friend as opposed to the enemy. And you get the questions, but you kind of strip out sort of the embedded sort of conclusions within the question, which is that this is a bad idea, for example. Yeah, you get the neutral questions, and now you have the ammunition you need to make sure you limit your blind spots as an innovator. You hopefully will be able to go down some of those rabbit holes of these key questions and come back up with real information. Hey, this is truly a hard problem, or it's not as hard as we thought. And then when you get to the point where you can make a confident recommendation, you actually understand sort of the why behind the skepticism. You've been able to address them more neutrally. And sometimes when you're working with someone who was initially skeptical, they change their mind and they say, wow, you really did your work. You covered the blind spots. They're not as bad as I thought. Maybe we should take this forward.
Yeah. It's so interesting that the skunk works actually is a symptom. And now that you mention it, it kind of makes sense to me, and that it's much better to solve the issue at the fundamental, the basic layer, and get the organization as such ready for innovation, ready for good decisions. Just for me to mentally save this on my hard drive, how would you summarize your methodology?
Well, it's really about starting with the definition stage, like what is, for the idea or objective, what is the real problem to solve? So for example, let's say someone had a bright idea. The CEO of McDonald said, let's do a subscription for coffee, right? Now, what are we really trying to solve for here? It's not to, make a little bit of profit on a subscription, like let's say Netflix or something like that. A subscription for coffee at McDonald's, the real problem to solve is to increase the frequency of the customer visits. Just get people to come in one more time a week or a month. And sometimes when they do that for the coffee, they'll get a sandwich, and that's really where the money is made. And so, really being clear on the definition of like, what's the problem we're trying to solve. So the steps would be, the definition of the problem, building an exploration, which is essentially a breadth and depth of the right questions, going down those rabbit holes, coming back up and coming up with some recommendations or some conclusions that you can draw from your exploration. And then pulling that together into some sort of package. And every company has a different sort of package that they look for when they come to a decision point. So it's essentially centered on building the right exploration and creating space for very purposeful exploration that doesn't take a long time.
That makes a lot of sense. Obviously, with AI, all of that is up in the air and changing, right? It informs leadership, it changes decision-making, it impacts how we can predict the future. So what does good decision or great decision-making look like in the age of AI?
Well, I think the world is going to be very surprised because AI is going to take the velocity up so much. So both velocity and quality. And I'm not referring to, back office, standard operating procedure, things that are easy to create an AI agent around, like, for example, insurance claims, very structured, and, as yes, no decision or things like that. I'm talking about strategic decisions in companies, even the one that example we just referred to, Oliver, which is coffee subscription for McDonald's. It's more of an ambiguous idea. It's not a clear yes or no. There's a lot to it, a lot of texture there. And I think AI is going to really supercharge the decision-making ability of companies that actually integrate AI into their strategic workflows, things like their cross-functional work, their bigger ideas. And that, I think, is going to be, huge. Now, I do at the same time think very few companies are being bold and embracing that kind of territory right now. But most companies, the way they work is, they read that someone is the innovator and they all want to be lemmings and get there quickly. So I think it will happen. It's just kind of an underserved opportunity today.
Yeah. And that's a problem you're working on right now, right? As the founder of Ritual. Talk to us about Ritual. So what is your current mission? What are you trying to make happen now?
Yeah, so Ritual is an AI native workspace, and it's really designed for cross-functional work. Everything from, let's say, creating a strategy narrative, which is a practice at places like Amazon, to creating, let's say, a scope requirements document, which is more of a product thing, to even a marketing brief. The thing that all of these things have in common, Oliver, is that they are cross-functional in nature. Like getting the right deliverable is basically, it takes a little bit of a brain trust, and they all need to go through like the general kind of flow of problem solving. Like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What are the key questions we need to get on top of? How do we do a good job of exploration and discovery? And then what do we actually recommend as the actual execution that we should pursue as an organization? And so Ritual kind of allows people to pick a template for what they're working on and use this AI native workspace to go through this flow and kind of work with others on that deliverable.
I mean, it sounds like it relies obviously on information sharing and access to the data and information across the company. There's a technical component here to make that possible. And then usually there's a human component as well, because in some organizations, people like to view their information as theirs and not necessarily willing to share it. Is that something you can help overcome?
Well, interestingly, most problems are not unique. It's a very strong starting point in large language models for almost any idea, even something like some of the ideas we've spoken with here. The language models can give you probably 70 to 75% of the way there. Mm-hmm. Our approach in Ritual is to pair human collaboration with AI. So AI is a co-pilot. It helps humans overcome cold start problems. So for example, rather than saying, hey, what's the problem you're working on? You kind of give it some raw input. And then the Ritual machine helps you structure the problem space. Well, are you working on the operational aspect of this, or the business model part of this, or the supply chain part of this? We help you think through what aspect of the problem you're trying to bite off, and then actually help you craft the problem statement. So it's kind of breaking it down into the atomic steps, like problem definition and building an exploration, and helping a human overcome cold start problems so they get so they do those things very precisely.
Right. So they can take decisions and solve problems and get tasks done quicker and probably to higher quality.
They can produce their recommendations and their recommended plan of action. And the most important thing is they can explain how they got there.
Yeah.
So why did you pick this, and why are you confident about it? So in the end, we measure ourselves on the confidence of the team in putting their recommendations on the table, and the confidence of the stakeholders in being able to take a decision.
Right. I've seen some people refer to Ritual as a McKinsey killer. Is that terminology you use, or how did this come about?
Well, I mean, we really like to work with those type of organizations to help them modernize and stay relevant in an AI era. The relationship to the McKinseys of the world is essentially that, a good consultant is somebody who sometimes you inject into an organization for good problem solving. You're kind of stuck, and you want someone who's outside the weeds to help you think through some of these things, like what's the real opportunity? What are the possibilities? What are the options? Which ones involve what level of risk and upside, all of those things. So this is essentially good problem solving. And with an AI tool like Ritual, any team in any organization can kind of do it self-service, right? Mm-hmm. Why it then calls into play, well, what is the future of consultants, And this is always a more complicated answer than, they exist or they don't exist. I think they will need to evolve. So you can imagine organizations like this kind of integrating something like ritual into their client interactions to just increase the velocity and quality of the work. There'll still be value that they can add on top, for sure.
Yeah, I would assume that ritual is a little cheaper than McKinsey. And I think more and more people question why consultants would earn millions for something that AI could do, or, what role do they actually play? So my personal hypothesis would be that the big management consultancies, they're looking at a future that's similar to the ad agencies and marketing agencies and now PR agencies, which are still around, but they're nowhere near as big or powerful as they used to be, because people do more in-house, they get more sophisticated in-house, they have better tools in-house, and therefore they need them less. Plus the technological disruption, what Meta can do with advertising, for instance. You upload a few photos and they create a hyper-personalized campaign, at a very low price point. That is not something an agency or consultancy could compete with.
Yeah, I mean, those things obviously are very favorable for a tool provider like Ritual, because now you're evening the scales, exactly as you said, Oliver, between the client or the Fortune 1000 and the consultant community. They have the same skill sets and capacity to unlock their human capital, with the tool and AI infused tools. So I think that's a powerful driver. But at the same time, these are there's a lot of bright people in these organizations like McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and others. And I'm sure they're thinking very hard about how they evolve their business model, maybe something that's more agentic. Now, what I mean by that is that obviously a tool is very central in that model, but also some data, and so if they're really if they're really thinking about the future, I think they want to think about the unique data that they could have where, a client needs to hire them because their data set is just more precise on some of the decision-making recommendations that are going to come out of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing I always wonder is that with all these changes in organizations, and there's so much mental flexibility we all have to keep, I wonder, how leaders need to communicate to ensure that their teams are open to these changes. Because as we know from surveys, from studies, a lot or even most change processes in large organizations fail, and it's partly due to poor communication by leadership. There's no good change story. Often it's not communicated in a sustainable way. It's a one-off launch, and then you're done here. People worry about their jobs, loss of status, loss of income, etc. So there may be some resistance as well. What would you advise leaders to how to approach this and how to communicate about these very rapid changes we all see?
I would first advise them to acknowledge that there's a lot of resistance, as you said, Oliver. Sam Altman talks about coevolution. However, in the business community, we're simply not doing it. We're grabbing the upside for sure. We're looking at redundancy, and we're looking at knowledge work, and looking at replacing people with co-pilots and agents and all that upside. However, we're not talking about upskilling at all, and upskilling is a message we need to get out there. So my vision for the organizations is that you do a better definition of defining what is the contribution you want from the next gen knowledge worker. And you might say things like, the kinds of things I talk about are, well, in the past, a knowledge worker administrated knowledge. Maybe someone else came up with it, but they administer it and they kind of carry it into the organization. But in the future or now, we need the knowledge worker to originate new knowledge. So what could that look like in terms of human contribution? So to me, those type of things are doable, but organizations need to kind of define what that is and how you upskill people towards those contributions that they will always value. And they need to do that in concert with the efficiencies that they're taking. Today, the left and right hand are not talking.
Yeah, that is true. And to me, upskilling is, I totally agree. I would maybe even widen the definition a little bit and say it's the mindset, the skill set, and the tool set that people require in order to, become knowledgeable or stay in the game almost, because it's very hard if you lose touch with technologies and the skill set and the mindset that is required now. I think tool set is almost the easier part, right? A company can just decide, let's get these tools and make sure they're accessible to people. The skill set, as you said, that's part of upskilling. I think companies know how to do this. The mindset is often a little more tricky because that is very hard to influence from the top. And at the end of the day, the responsibility of each individual to ensure we have an open mindset and a growth mindset and want to work with these tools and not just, apply resistance.
100%. Yes. I mean, we're seeing it every day, right? I mean, we've heard news about Amazon saying, hey, you cannot put someone up for promotion unless they can demonstrate how they've integrated AI into their work, their workflow, which of course makes a lot of sense on the software development side and everywhere. Actually, I think their message was for software developers, which makes a lot of sense because, the 100-person startup is doing that. And so how can Amazon compete if their people are not using the same tools, right? Yeah. But at the same time, where's the other end of the message around, okay, if I do that and I'm training the model, then what does it mean for me? Maybe there'll be less promotional pathways. Is that okay? Is that not okay? What does that mean for promotional paths, for compensation, for longevity in the firm, for rotational opportunities, for skill set growth? You need a holistic approach for this. I would imagine that big tech probably has the resources to actually think through it more strategically.
Yeah, that is true. And I mean, no doubt these layoffs are real. They will be happening. I think you would just need fewer people to do the same thing or even grow in the future. So it's not to be underestimated that is a real challenge for societies, but also individuals.
Yes, exactly. I think we're kind of at that moment, we need a way forward. I do think, to shed a positive light that the next gen knowledge worker will be actually very empowered. Everything will change. I think that this person will have, more contribution and stamp on the decisions that a company makes. I think the compensation structures will change. I think they'll get a lot of, satisfaction from what they're contributing to organizations. I think they'll be the 10x knowledge worker. It's just, how do we clarify what that looks like so people can actually get there?
Yeah, exactly. And at a personal level, you've worked for some of the largest organizations in the world for many years. Now you're a founder, you're in the driving seat. What's the hardest part of, switching from being a C-level in a large organization to being the founder?
I mean, most people who make the switch would say resources because, they were delegating. That's not my problem because I have no problem with rolling up my sleeves. And I was always willing to roll up my sleeves and be connected to the details. But I think it truly is bandwidth, actually, because when I have an amazing co-founder and we have a team, we're not large, we're, still a dozen people or so. But, even putting that aside, it's really tremendous bandwidth issues because when you're creating a new product, you need to be the voice of the customer and have, really be focused on that. You need to be selling your product. You need to be being a product manager. You need to be a QA tester. You need to be writing marketing copy. You have to be out there on social. You have to do events, and not just from networking, but from a thought leadership standpoint. And so the bandwidth to do all these things, the context switching, the mode, you just want to make sure you don't drop any particular ball or opportunity. But there's a part of this which just requires a degree of patience, because the good news in a startup is, your biggest problem today is probably not going to be your biggest problem in 3 months. You will have kind of conquered that small hill and moved on to the next one.
Yeah, it does require a lot of bandwidth. I'm totally with you. You built a huge network in the course of your career. So lots of people to choose from when it comes to collaborating and seeking out relationships, partnerships, etc. How do you choose who to collaborate with?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I really look for people who are like-minded in the sense that one, they realize that the world is bigger than them. That to me is really important. And what do I mean by that is that, they show gratitude. Like if someone helped them or gave them opened the door in their career, that they're likely to do it for other people. These are the kind of people who are worth investing in relationship wise. And you may work in a different organization than them now. But it's really great to kind of stay in touch with those people and maybe help them think through issues going on in their workplace or their next move. Because that's sort of the way some of the good aspects of kind of working with people in a work context can actually improve other people's lives. And I've been fortunate enough to have, just so many of those great relationships. So it becomes a little bit of a community. In some ways, I feel like even though you may be at a company, it doesn't matter how long you're at a company. If you kind of show who you really are, that connection can be strong and you are kind of building a community. And one positive of growing a little bit older, like I am, is that over time, you kind of step back and say, wow, I'm part of a community of people and that feels really good.
And what would you recommend to your younger self 20, 30 years ago? What do you know about community building, relationship building that you didn't know then?
I think it's about investing in people and taking a long-term approach.
Yes.
And very practical people will say, oh, because the world is small and, who knows what one's fate will be. But that I think is a little bit too, kind of commercial. I'm not coming at it from a commercial standpoint of like, oh, let me invest in Oliver and break some bread together because, you might run Google in the future. It's not really about that. It's interestingly, you might have worked with someone 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but they always remember who you are, like how you carried yourself, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very powerful because later on in life, that they remember that and that's just the basis for a strong connection. And of course, if you need some assistance, then obviously that they're more likely to want to help, a good guy or gal than somebody who wasn't perceived as such.
And often that's how people are remembered as, someone I worked with 10 years ago. I was like, yeah, he's a good guy. Happy to help him with whatever he's asking me to do. And what helps me is to come from a position of generosity, trying to at least, and not having any expectations, right? Because I think if you have expectations that people return favors, etc., you almost set yourself up for disappointment. And I think it's good to just let go of that and just be generous, try to be at least. And whatever comes back my way, that's good karma. And if not, that's totally fine as well.
Yeah. And you had asked me, Oliver, if I could give advice to my younger self would be like clear a little bit of time, even 5% of my plate, when I was 25 and 30 and 35, to do those generous acts. And I think when you're a very busy person and you're juggling like a very ambitious plate, of family and work and a bunch of things like that, then maybe, even 1% feels like a big thing to sacrifice. You don't have it, but if you can even carve out a little bit, just to act unconditionally without any expectation, that's a good habit to build. I mean, later on, you might get more time for it, but if you build it earlier, it's better.
Yeah, that's so good. Such good advice. And let's bring this on to Len. Atif, thank you. I appreciate that you sharing these hard-learned lessons. I mean, you're such an experienced person in the corporate world, in the startup world, in the digital world. So I appreciate you openly sharing your insights and lessons with us. This is always my last question. What's your best piece of communications advice?
I think as a leader in particular is to create clarity. The interesting thing about clarity is that the interesting conundrum for a leader is that a leader must seek clarity, but also provide clarity. I think the second part people probably understand, which is like, we have 30 minutes together. In the end, the leader should set clear expectations. Oh, we're okay with this. This is kind of ambition we have. This is kind of risk we're okay with, if these are kind of mistakes that I'm not too worried about. Okay, that's the clarity and the parameters the team needs to go do their thing. But the first part is actually even more powerful and essential, which is to seek clarity. And what I mean by that is in that same meeting, in the first few minutes of that 30 minutes, the listening and the questioning, so that you can invite contribution and perspective and get the brain trust active so you could have enough of the inputs to then provide the clarity. So you need to seek the clarity first. And I think that puts a leader in a good position to provide the clarity.
It's so good. And I don't think anyone in 300 episodes has ever put it that way. So I really appreciate it, Atif. Seek clarity, provide clarity. That's one of the key tasks of any leader. Thank you.
You're most welcome. I really enjoyed this conversation, Oliver.
Me too. That was awesome. Thank you.